The warm red glow of the sign I designed blurred behind the Seattle rain as I stood across the street. In my hands, the slick cover of a local food magazine felt heavier than it should. It wasn't my face smiling back from the cover, but my brother, Vincent's. The headline called him a young genius for reviving our family's restaurant, Lavinia. He was pointing at the logo, my logo, the one born from countless sleepless nights and endless revisions. They saw my work as a simple hobby, just doodles on a computer. They had no idea that those doodles were the only thing keeping the doors of their precious restaurant open. I was the silent architect of their success. But in my own family's story, I was just a ghost. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Alice, and I learned the hard way that sometimes the people who are supposed to see you most clearly are the ones who refuse to look at all. It's a lesson that started early, a quiet hum of dismissal beneath the surface of my childhood. I remember winning the district-wide art competition in 5th grade with a detailed watercolor of the Seattle skyline. My teacher was ecstatic, calling my parents to rave about my prodigious talent. But when I brought the blue ribbon home, my mother, Meredith, glanced at it for a moment before taping it to the fridge behind a grocery list. "That's lovely, dear," she'd said, before turning to my brother. "Vincent, tell your father about the goal you scored in the soccer game today." Vincent's goal had been in a practice scrimmage. My ribbon stayed on the fridge for 2 days before it was lost in a sea of coupons and reminders. A year later, for the school science fair, I built a working model of a water filtration system, complete with a hand-cranked pump. Vincent had forgotten his project until the night before, so I stayed up until 2 a.m., helping him glue together a lopsided model of the solar system from styrofoam balls. He got an honorable mention. My parents took him out for ice cream to celebrate his knack for science. I was told to stay home and clean up the glitter and glue from the living room floor. That was the year of our shared birthday party. Our birthdays are only a week apart. I had asked for a set of professional colored pencils. He wanted a new video game console. They got him the console. And for me, a small sketchbook with a note that said, "So you can design levels for your brother's new game." The warm red glow of the sign I designed blurred behind the Seattle rain as I stood across the street, the memory as vivid as the neon in my hands. The slick cover of a local food magazine felt heavier than it should. It wasn't my face smiling back, but Vincent's. The headline called him a young genius for reviving our family's restaurant, La Vigna. He was pointing at the logo, my logo, the one born from countless sleepless nights on the powerful graphic design computer I had bought with my own money. I'd had to save for a year, working a second job at a coffee shop, after my parents refused to help, my father Walter calling it an expensive toy. A month after they refused me, they co-signed a loan for Vincent's brand new graduation car, arguing it was essential for his future business career. They saw my work as a hobby, just doodles on a computer. They had no idea that those doodles were the only thing keeping the doors of their precious restaurant open. I was the silent architect of their success, but in my own family's story, I was just a ghost. For years, La Vigna had been slowly fading. It was a relic of my grandparents' generation, with faded red checkered tablecloths and a menu that hadn't changed since the 1980s. When my parents handed the reins to Vincent 2 years ago, it was on the verge of bankruptcy. I remember the day before he officially took over. A health inspector had left them with a long, terrifying list of violations and a C rating that was one step away from being shut down. Vincent had thrown the report on the table in a panic. I spent the next 48 hours creating clear, bilingual workflow charts for the kitchen staff, designing new sanitation station signage, and reorganizing their entire storage system based on food safety protocols I researched online. The inspector came back and gave them an A. Vincent told everyone he had whipped the staff into shape. I remember just 6 months prior, he had botched a massive catering order for a corporate client, mixing up the delivery times and ordering the wrong ingredients. I spent an entire weekend without sleep, redesigning the entire catering menu on the fly, creating custom labels, and personally calling the client with a new, elegant proposal that saved the contract. Vincent told my parents he had handled the crisis with decisive leadership. Before that, there was the disastrous Valentine's Day when our head chef, an old-timer named Marco, had a family emergency. Vincent panicked. I spent the afternoon on the phone, calling every culinary student I knew until I found a replacement, then designed and printed a simplified, romantic prix-fixe menu that the new chef could execute. Vincent later told a local blogger it was his idea to streamline the menu to enhance the romantic ambiance. The real work, the work that turned the tide, happened in the quiet of my small apartment. It started subtly. I redesigned the menu, replacing the old, greasy pages with elegant cards. I created a website, something my father had always called a waste of time. I started a social media presence from scratch, posting beautifully lit photos of the food that I took myself on weekends. I even set up a new online reservation system after Vincent complained that he was too busy to answer the phone, a system that immediately reduced no-shows by 30%. I even tried to teach him how to use a simple app to update the daily specials himself. He gave up after 5 minutes, tossing the phone on the counter. "This is tedious, Alice. That's what I have you for." "Isn't it?" Slowly. New faces started appearing. The restaurant's revenue began to climb. Vincent took all the credit, speaking of his innovative management strategies at family dinners. And my mother would beam at him, her eyes shining with a pride she never once directed at me. One evening, I overheard my mother on the phone with my aunt. "Oh, Vincent is a natural," she gushed. "It's in his blood. Alice is more, well, she's creative. It's a different kind of intelligence, I suppose." The backhanded compliment stung more than any insult. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday night. It was supposed to be the most important night in Lavinia's history. A prominent investor, a Mr. Sterling, who specialized in expanding local restaurants, was coming for dinner. This was it, the culmination of all my unseen work. I spent the entire week preparing a professional branding kit, a sleek portfolio with market data and growth projections. I researched Mr. Sterling himself, discovered his appreciation for sustainable sourcing, and wove that into a new potential mission statement for the restaurant. The day before the dinner, I tried to show it to my mother, my heart pounding with a foolish hope. She glanced at the cover for a second before waving a dismissive hand. "That's nice, dear," she'd said, her attention on her phone. "But have you seen the new suit Vincent bought for the meeting? He's going to look so sharp." Later that evening, she'd called me, her voice syrupy. "Alice, darling, Vincent is just a little short for the suit. Could you be a dear and send him a few $100s? Think of it as an investment in all our futures." I did, transferring the money from my savings account, the one I was trying to build for a down payment on my own apartment. The air in the restaurant was thick with forced pleasantries. When I arrived, I saw my name card was placed at the far end of the table, next to the kitchen door. Quietly, I switched it with a floral arrangement, moving myself closer to the center. My mother saw, and her lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. Vincent was holding court, telling exaggerated stories. At one point, he used a specific, well-researched phrase about honoring culinary tradition while embracing modernity that he'd overheard me practicing in my apartment last week, presenting it as his own philosophy. Mr. Sterling, a sharp man, turned to me. "And what's your role in this turnaround, Alice?" he asked kindly. Before I could form a sentence, my mother jumped in. "Alice is our family's biggest cheerleader," she chirped, patting my hand. The condescension was suffocating. I sat quietly, waiting after the main course, as the espresso was being served. I saw my opening. I cleared my throat and placed my professionally bound presentation on the table. "Mr. Sterling," I began, my voice steady. I prepared a brief overview of Lavinia's brand strategy and its potential for scalable growth. Before I could even open the first page, my mother's hand landed on mine, her nails pressing down. She let out a tinkling, dismissive laugh. Oh, Mr. Sterling, don't you mind Alice? She said, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. She just loves to draw on her computer. It's her little hobby. Vincent is the real business brain in this family. The table chuckled. Mr. Sterling gave me a brief, confused smile. I felt the blood drain from my face. I tried to speak again, but my mother's gaze cut me off. Her eyes were cold and hard as stone. Honestly, Alice, she whispered. Her voice ablaze meant only for me. With that attitude, you don't deserve a seat at this table. The rest of the dinner was a blur. The next morning, we received a polite email from Mr. Sterling's assistant. He had decided to pursue other investment opportunities. The blame, swift and merciless, fell on me. My father was the first to strike. If you had just known your place, Alice, he said, his voice heavy with disdain. You always have to make things about you. His lecture triggered a sharp, painful memory from college. I had desperately needed $200 for a design software license for my final thesis. He had spent an hour lecturing me about budgeting. While the very next week, he proudly told me he'd given Vincent $2,000 for a networking trip to Cancun that was nothing more than a spring break vacation. My mother followed up with an email, not a call. The subject line was simply disappointment. The body of the email was a long, rambling paragraph about how I had embarrassed them and how I needed to learn to support my brother without needing the spotlight. That was when the hurt, the deep, aching wound I had carried for years, didn't just break me, it hardened me. The tears never came. In their place, a cold, clear resolve settled in my chest. I hung up the phone and immediately called my best friend, Jenna. She was a fiercely intelligent intellectual property lawyer. I met her for coffee and laid everything out. As I spoke, her expression shifted from sympathy to a slow-burning anger. I remember at your parents' last anniversary, she said, her voice tight. Vincent gave that long speech, and your mom toasted him. No one mentioned you once, even though you'd designed the invitations and organized the whole event. She was right. This isn't a family dispute, she finally said, her voice firm. Legally. This is unjust enrichment. They have profited from your labor without compensation. You are their unpaid brand strategist, and they are infringing on your work. Jenna's words were the permission I needed. That night, I didn't sleep. I worked. I was excavating the last 3 years of my life. I compiled every email, every original, timestamped design file. I found the invoice for the restaurant's new espresso machine, the one Vincent boasted he'd gotten a killer deal on. I found the email thread where I had spent a week negotiating with a supplier for a refurbished model at half the price, which he had simply forwarded to my father with the words, "Got it handled." While searching through old files, I found a digital copy of a birthday card from my parents from a few years back. "We're so proud of your artistic talents." It read, "We just hope you find a real career to fall back on soon." The condescension was a punch to the gut. The next day, I hired a professional, independent brand valuation firm. I asked them for one thing, a number, a clear, objective, market rate valuation of the creative services rendered. During that week of waiting, my family's silence was absolute. The only contact was a single text from Vincent. "Hope you're thinking about how you're gonna make this right. We're all very disappointed." The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. Then, a few days later, he left a voicemail. "Look, I know you're upset," he began, his voice oozing false generosity. "Why don't you design a new dessert menu? We'll even put design by Alice at the bottom. How's that for a peace offering?" The offer was so small, so insulting, it was laughable. The consultant from the valuation firm called me the day before the report was ready, his voice buzzing with professional excitement. "I have to say," he told me, "whoever did this rebranding is a top-tier professional. They've created significant, measurable value here. This is an open and shut case of brand equity transformation." That external validation was like a suit of armor. With the report in hand, I made the call. "Mom," I said, my voice even and cool, "I'd like to schedule an emergency family meeting at the restaurant this Sunday. I have a final proposal to help save the business." The surprise in her voice was quickly replaced by a smug satisfaction. "Oh?" she said. "Well, I'm glad to see you're finally ready to be reasonable. Dear, of course. They thought I was coming to beg. They had no idea I was coming to collect." The atmosphere at Lavinia that Sunday was thick with condescension. As I walked in, my father pulled me aside. "Listen, Alice," he said in a low, placating tone. "Your grandmother loved this place. What would Nana think of you tearing this family apart over some drawings? Just be a good girl and apologize." I just looked at him, my silence a wall he couldn't penetrate. We sat at the main table, a tribunal ready to pass judgment. Right before we began, my mother leaned over to my father, whispering loudly enough for me to hear. "Let's just get this over with. She probably just wants money for her rent." Vincent unrolled an amateurish drawing of a 2-for-1 pasta night banner. My mother nodded enthusiastically. She let him speak for 10 minutes before she finally turned to me, her face a mask of weary disappointment. "Well, Alice, we're all waiting. I hope your proposal is an apology." She sighed dramatically. "You know, you really don't understand your place here, do you?" I didn't flinch. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice clear. "I don't belong at this table." I simply took out my laptop, connected it to the large television, and clicked a single file. The first slide was a sleek professional title page, Ella Vigna Brand Strategy and Asset Valuation, prepared by Alice Miller. A stunned silence fell. I stood up and began to present, not as their daughter, but as the consultant they had never paid. I walked them through every single step, showing side-by-side analytics of website traffic, social media engagement, and 5-star reviews that specifically mentioned the beautiful atmosphere and gorgeous menus. Their faces slowly transformed from smugness to confusion, then to a pale, sickly horror. I clicked to the final slide. It detailed the market rate for a senior brand strategist's services over 3 years, and at the bottom, highlighted in a calm, professional blue, was the grand total. Total billable services rendered $185,000. The only sound was the quiet hum of the television. My mother found her voice first, a sharp, venomous hiss. "How dare you?" she said. "How dare you put a price on what you do for your family? This is disgusting." I closed my laptop, ignoring her outburst. I looked at each of them, one by one. Then I placed a single, neatly bound document on the table. It was a legal contract drafted by Jenna. "You have 2 options," I said, my voice devoid of anger, devoid of pain. It was just the voice of business. "Option 1, you agree to a payment plan for the full amount, and I will sign over the full intellectual property rights to the Lavigna brand. Option 2, I file a cease and desist order tomorrow morning, and you will immediately stop using my logo, my menus, my website, and any other brand assets I created." I didn't wait for an answer. I picked up my purse, turned my back on their stunned, horrified faces, and walked to the front door. As I stepped out into the cool Seattle air, I took a deep breath, a real one, the first one in years. A weight I didn't even know I was carrying, the weight of their expectations. Their dismissals, their casual cruelty lifted from my shoulders. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had just handed them the bill for destroying me. And as the door to Lavinia clicked shut behind me, I knew I wasn't leaving anything behind. I was finally walking toward myself.